Well, good evening. Yeah, how many of you kids just love dinosaurs? Anybody? Boy, look at the hands go up. Oh, you got a few moms and dads, too. And I know most of you moms and dads secretly enjoy this stuff. It took my wife a long time. By the way, we celebrate our 39th anniversary tomorrow. And so she'll be here a little bit later. She conducts and accompanies one of the Columbia Children's Choir concerts, so she's also involved with kids. But we have been involved with doing this ministry now for over 40 years, and we have seen the gamut as far as philosophies and ideas, and lots of things change. Let me give you an example. How many of you are familiar with the dinosaur Brontosaurus? Any of you? Look, it's mostly the older people that are, because that was the first dinosaur that made it into the public early on in the 1900s, 20th century. And it was Sinclair gasoline that primarily made it famous. So the green dinosaur you see, Sinclair, that's supposed to be Brontosaurus. But it has earned the nickname the dinosaur that never was. Because when it was found, it was shipped to a famous dinosaur hunter back east. And putting it together, he noticed there wasn't a head and no feet. And so he thought he had a new species of dinosaur and concocted a new head for it and named it Brontosaurus excelsus, Thunder Lizard the Great. And that became the icon of dinosaurs. And then in about the 1990s, the post office issued 4 stamps to commemorate dinosaurs. One of them happened to be Brontosaurus. And of course, the paleontological community had figured it out years before this. And they hadn't said much to anybody publicly, but they accused the post office of misleading the public. And so this feud broke out between the United States Postal Service and the paleontologists, back and forth, back and forth. But if you can get your hands on those stamps, they're kind of a nice little collector's item to have. There's one of those stamps, Brontosaurus, the dinosaur that never was. That's the kind of stuff that changes all the time. When scientists tell us about dinosaurs, they're so confident. And they say, look, this is the facts, this is the way it is, this is how they ate, this is what they looked like, this was their mating habits, this was their communal habits, and so on and so forth. And of course, no human being that I know of has had a chance really to study living dinosaurs. So we actually know very little about dinosaurs. And in fact, just because dinosaurs have teeth doesn't mean that it is a ferocious meat eater. I've got this huge skull of T-Rex in my collection. My wife will not let me store it at home, so I store it some other place. But it has, gargantuan teeth. This skull is 5 feet long. And the kids are always, the eyes get real big when they see it, because this was the ferocious meat eater. And I began to call it Wimposaurus, because, teeth aren't an indication of what kind of a dinosaur they were. The panda bear's favorite food is the bamboo, and it has very sharp teeth. The grizzly bear is an omnivore. And usually the best time to see grizzly bears in Yellowstone is when they go after a carcass that's been laying in the sun for a while. You rarely, I don't know of anybody that's really seen a grizzly bear go after live food. It usually is a scavenger. And so I wonder if perhaps T-Rex was also that way. And you kids, how many of you enjoy going to McDonald's? You like going to McDonald's? A few of you do. Yeah. Do you ever go to McDonald's and order the buns with lettuce and pickles on it, and that's it? That's what you like? Yeah, we go for the meat, don't we? We want the hamburger. And that doesn't mean, though, that you're a carnivore, does it? It means that you like to eat a lot of things. And so you are an omnivore. And most likely, that's exactly the way T-Rex was. So we're going to talk a little bit about dinosaurs, the Bible, and the ark. Now, this can be a very intimidating subject. In fact, people try to convince us that we believe in fairy tales, and they laugh at us. It's an intimidating subject. And I think there are some things that we can learn as Christians. We need to be better prepared to answer some of the questions and challenges. One of the big challenges that we have as believers is just simply know our scriptures better. Most people can't turn right now to the Genesis flood in Genesis. Most Christians can't do it. They can't tell you at what point in Noah's life the flood took place. They can't tell you that what part in the genealogy of Adam was Noah. So these are things that we just don't know our scriptures very well. And that's one of the strongest things in your favor. You've got a strong historical book, and this book has revelation in it. God made certain things known to us. And we take Genesis, and it's kind of controversial, so we put it over here and kind of concentrate on the bigger miracle, Jesus rising from the dead. When I was in college, I went to a very liberal school, the University of Kansas. They're really famous here the last few days. I don't know if you've seen the stuff on the news of the big brawl that took place on the court. I mean, it was so unlike Kansas. My wife and I are both KU grads, and we looked at it and just in shock. This is Kansas. And but this is a very liberal school. When I went there, it was called the Berkeley of the Midwest. So there was all kinds of crud there. But that's where I became a believer in my senior year of college. And let me tell you, it's just downright intimidating to face some of these things. But I struggled right after I became a believer. I had to decide. Either I was going to accept the entire Bible as true, or it was all suspect. And that is just a decision that you have to sit down and make if you've not made it. You cannot ignore Genesis. It's a very real part of the history of the Messiah, history of Israel, and our history is tied up in it. Without Genesis, you have no Savior. And so these are things that I think if you can just master your scriptures, you'll do much, much better in handling some of these objections. The key to understanding the big mysteries of the dinosaurs, their origin, their place in history, and their disappearance, is the Genesis flood. It's what I call the pivotal point of Earth's geological past. It's that point right there when the flood took place. Either it's a myth or it was a catastrophic historical event. And if it was a catastrophic historical event, it can explain the main mysteries of the dinosaurs. And we'll get into that a little bit tonight. The Genesis flood, just a casual reading of Genesis 7 and 8, will tell you the Genesis flood was a historical event. It was a global event, not some just localized flood. That's what we experience today. The Great Missoula flood was a local flood. But the Genesis flood was a global event. It was a geological event. When the fountains of the Great Deep burst open on the first day of the flood, to me as a geologist, there are a lot of geological implications in that. And to ignore those, I think, then is to miss the solutions to many of the mysteries that we face. And the Genesis flood was a destructive event. The earth completely changed. What we observe now is just a remnant of what God originally created. We all like the mountains. I spent a lot of time in the mountains. I've been to Yellowstone, probably 4 or 5 dozen times. Have not seen the whole thing yet. And I grew up near there. It was kind of in my backyard. I love it. It's got a lot of things to see. But I'll tell you, it is a remnant of the beauty that God originally created. It is not the finished product. It is a damaged product. And that's one thing the flood definitely teaches. So let's begin here by asking a question. How old are these dinosaur bones? What do you think? Can I get some volunteers to give me a A couple of answers. Anybody want to take a guess? How old are these dinosaur bones? Anybody? 5,000 years. That's a dad talking back there, right? Come on, I asked for the kids. The kids, the real little kids. Okay, kids, any ideas? Yes, real loud. Excuse me? 100 years? Anybody else? 4,000, 5,000, 100. Somebody over here, lights and loud? 65 million. Okay, now, do you see the parameters we've got? How do we decide? If I showed you a coin in my pocket, like a quarter, could you tell me how old that quarter was? How would I tell that? It's got a date on it. I have been looking for over 40 years for fossils with dates on them. I have yet to find one. They are not there. So we really don't know how old they are unless we have some guidelines. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but science cannot directly date dinosaur bones. Did you know that? They never directly date dinosaur bones. Dinosaur bones are dated by what they believe about the fossils. They're also dated by what they believe about volcanic rocks nearby. If they find volcanic rocks nearby, they assume that the bones they found over here are the same age as those volcanic rocks. But those are assumptions. They're guesses. They're not absolute. In fact, you know, the person who discovered the first T-Rex in Montana, not too far from where I grew up, his name was Barnum Brown. He was called Mr. Bones, one of the big dinosaur hunters of the early 1900s. KU graduate, by the way. And so as he's preparing these bones of T-Rex, he was describing them, and you know what his age for T-Rex was? 1 million years old. Isn't that interesting? And he was a paleontologist. So dates are all over the place, but they're really determined by what they believe about the fossils. Science cannot help us solve the mystery of the dinosaurs. They can offer a lot of guesses and assumptions. Those change about every 5 to 10 years, completely change from the way that T-Rex walked around. You know, when I was a kid, it was thought that his tail was used as a balance mechanism. So he walked uprightly with his tail as a balancing system. Stegosaurus, it was believed, because he was so big and clumsy and had a small skull, that he must have had two brains, one in his head and one in his tail. And you know, these are beliefs that they had, and this is what I learned as a kid, and I was taught as fact. But by the time I went off to college, all of that changed. So just give it another 5 years or so, and everything you learned about dinosaurs will have changed. Indirect methods rely on opinions. Don't ever forget that. Anything that's indirectly dated is always based on opinions. What you really need are historical documents and eyewitness accounts. And those are really the only dependable source. This is how we build our views of ancient history, as flawed as it is, because the historical documents we have are very sparse, with the exception of one. Can you guess which one that is? The Bible. The Bible is a historical document, and it's full of history that went back before the Greeks, before the Romans, before the Assyrians, before the Egyptians. Here's a little thing I like to mention here about Egypt. You know, the word Egypt first shows up in Genesis 12 when it says that Abraham went down to Egypt. I got curious one day, several years ago. It just began to bother me. Boy, there's no word Egypt in the Hebrew language. Well, what is that word, Egypt? And of course, we're told by archaeologists that Egypt is far older than the Bible, and that the Bible got most of its stories from a lot of the Egyptian myths. Except that the word Egypt, and you look at it in the Hebrew, it is Mizraim. Now, who is Mizraim? It's the grandson of Noah. Now do you see the pieces begin to fit together? The flood, the Tower of Babel, and then Egypt begins. So we put it in the right time frame, and immediately we start solving a lot of mysteries. And this is the benefit of having the Bible as a reliable historical document. Well, the word dinosaur, where did it come from? Well, it was invented by this guy, Sir Richard Owen. He named it dinosaur, two Greek words meaning terrible lizard, and it's lizard, by the way. A lot of paleontologists today will argue that dinosaurs are not lizards, but they're reptiles. Well, that's not what Sir Richard Owen thought. Sir Richard Owen thought they were most like the monitor lizard. In fact, when he gave the name dinosaur to some bones, there were only 3 recognizable dinosaurs of his day, just 3. And they were very, very incomplete. But he was a brilliant man. Don't know if he was a believer or not, but he was anti-Darwin. And in fact, he was a real thorn in Darwin's side most of the time. He was the Queen Victoria's favorite scientist. He was called the Queen's paleontologist. And so a lot of what we know today about dinosaurs really came about, first of all, through him. But Sir Richard Owen must have come up with a word that, of course, was 1842. What do you suppose they called these beasts before Sir Richard Owen? From the Greek word drakon, or dragon, a serpent or a huge land or sea creature. And in fact, here's a very famous dinosaur hunter by the name of O.C. Marsh. You ever heard of Marsh? Marsh and another man named Cope found most of our dinosaurs that we know of today. They spent a lot of time in my backyard years and years and years and years ago looking for dinosaur fossils. And between the two of them, I believe they named something like 132 different species. But they were prolific in their discoveries. And he was the one who found the first pteranodon in the United States, and he found it in, of all places, western Kansas. Isn't that interesting? You know what he called it? He called these flying dragons. Isn't that interesting? It was a very common word. They didn't have in mind these fire-breathing, flappy-winged creatures that you see in a lot of mythology today. Dragon was simply the Greek idea of a Hebrew word we'll talk about here in a little bit. But dragon was the most commonly accepted word to describe these beasts until Sir Richard Owen came along. So here is the big question. Did dinosaurs really exist? What do you think, kids? Did they really exist? How do we know? Have you ever seen one? How do we know they existed? Well, the Bible doesn't use the word dinosaur. Did you know that? And we'll look at that too. Because that is a common accusation that gets thrown at me all the time. Hey, word dinosaur is not in the Bible. Stop talking about dinosaurs. They're not in the Bible, but I'll show you where they are. So here's how we know dinosaurs really existed. Look at this. There is a big femur. You see the size of that femur, that fossil bone, leg bone? The femur is this part from the hip down to the knee. And it's for a dinosaur. I mean, this is a huge bone. I have a reproduction of one that's, you stand it on its edge, and compare it to me, it's taller than I am. I mean, it's big. These are huge bones. And there you see a skull of a Sarcosuchus, big crocodile. Look at the size of that thing. That skull was way taller, or way longer than I am tall. So we have hundreds of thousands of fossil bones. all over the place. You can see a whole bunch I have back there on the table. I have several boxes of dinosaur bones that I have found through the years. They're all over the place. My first big bone I found was in the second grade. How many of you are in the second grade? Any second graders here? Any second grader? Yeah, I found my first big dinosaur bone. It was about like this. And it was the end of that femur, the lower end of the femur you see. And that really started me on. But dinosaur bones are quite common. They're buried all over the place. Now, here's something that we notice about dinosaur bones. Almost all dinosaur bones are found in sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock covers about 70% of the Earth's surface. Sedimentary rock is a mud rock or a sand rock, silt rock, limestone, and so on. These are what we call flood rocks. And you'll notice also in the shape of these dinosaur bones, you rarely find a complete skeleton. Rarely. Although you see them in museums all the time, right? There aren't that many complete dinosaurs, and they're usually smaller. The most complete T-Rex today is somewhere in the neighborhood of 65% complete. And he's been the most prolific big dinosaur found. Most of the time what we find are skulls. For instance, Triceratops. We have a lot of fossil skulls of Triceratops because there's a lot of bone involved. But not much of his skeleton is found buried along with it. What we do as museums, we contact Museum B over here and tell them, look, we're on the lookout for a skull to match the bones we found for Triceratops. They said, well, we just so happen to have found one in the field, and it's almost ready to reproduce. We will make you a copy, and in turn, we'd like a copy of your bones. So museums do that. They make casts of bones, and they exchange things. Otherwise, these things would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And when you go to museums, although they're starting to do this more, they recognize, look, there's a sign there that says this is a reproduction. But they didn't used to do that. And so every time you'd go to a museum, you'd think that, wow, dinosaur skeletons are all over the place. But they're not. In the early days, when the first Diplodocus was found, big, long, 80, 90-foot dinosaur, long-necked dinosaur was found, it's been one of the few complete or almost complete skeletons that were found in the late 1800s. Andrew Carnegie fell in love with it. And so what he did is we had a bunch of them made by copying with plaster Paris. He copied the bones. And then he shipped them all over the world so that every big museum could have a Diplodocus in their museum. So a lot of what you see are reproductions. I have several back here on my table. A Triceratops horn was found where we take our dinosaur digs. It was found in that particular area by the person, very good friend of mine. In fact, it's her property we hunt on. She made the cast of it. It's a Triceratops horn. And one like that complete would be close to $100,000. So it's not cheap stuff. But anyway, the shape of dinosaur bones we normally find are what we call disarticulated. It's a big word. It just means torn up and spread all around. This big wall here, in fact, it's the same wall, just different pictures, is Dinosaur National Monument, borders Utah and Colorado. If you've ever been there, or if you've not been there, it's worth taking the trip to it. You have to go out of the way a bit, but it's well worth it. This is where they pulled out a lot of dinosaurs until it just got to be too expensive. It would take as much as a year to extract bones out of this hard sedimentary rock. And can you imagine paying somebody $15 an hour to do that? I mean, this would be a full-time job and probably a very livable wage doing this, digging out dinosaur bones for the rest of your life. But it got too expensive, and they just couldn't afford it. So what they did was they built a building over it. And now it's a wall. It's about 150 feet long. It still has estimated 1,500 dinosaur bones in it, just sitting there. You can go up to them, you can touch them, you can see how big they are, and it's quite a display. But every one of them are disarticulated. There are no complete dinosaurs. And this is one of the best areas in the world for dinosaur bones. So we find them disarticulated, which really should tell us something, and that is the flood was a very catastrophic event and probably tore up a lot of animals as it buried them. And of course, they're disarticulated and spread all over the place. Now, here's another question I get asked a lot. Did dinosaurs really live with man? That one you really do get laughed at. Have you ever been laughed at by doing that? I was giving a talk one time to a room of, they were retired scientists. I was a little out of my league, I think. And these guys, were physicists and all kinds of things. It was a little intimidating. But when I got to talk to them about dinosaurs, one guy came up to me afterwards and said, "You are an absolute loony." So, yeah, okay, I understand. But this can be intimidating. But again, the only basis for really answering this question is really what our scriptures say as a history. And we'll look at that as we go on here. So why the Bible? Why do we even refer to the Bible? Well, we have to realize, of course, not many people will agree with you on this, but Orthodox Christianity, in other words, true Christianity, believes that God's spoken word is the Bible. It's called Revelation. What God chose to reveal to us. Now, it doesn't contain every detail and every fact of history, but it does give us enough to form a general picture. And from that picture, it provides us with a boundary to stay in so we can start answering some of the big questions. Well, if that's true, why aren't dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible? It's very interesting. When King James translation was done, it was done in 1611, there were no dinosaur bones, to my knowledge, that had been discovered and identified as big beasts. I mean, there were some that were found that were kind of curiosities, but that was just about it. So there's a particular Hebrew word we will look at that the scholars of that time translated to mean something, and consequently it took the whole idea of dinosaurs right out of the Bible. But that's because it had to wait till about 1842 for these critters to be identified as such. Now, although the word dinosaur is not mentioned in the Bible, the idea of dinosaurs is mentioned. So I want you to listen very closely here. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind." And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Then God said, where is the word dinosaur? No, he didn't say that. That's what we would say, isn't it? We would say, hey, the word dinosaur isn't even mentioned in the Bible. Well, I wouldn't expect it to, just because the word dinosaur was invented hundreds of years later. But the idea is, and here are those Hebrew words I talked to you about. Genesis chapter 1:21, day 5 of creation. God made the great sea monsters. That word is the Hebrew word tanin, and it means a great sea or land monster, and it's often translated as dragon in other parts of the Old Testament, the word tanin. Well, certainly this dinosaur here, or sea creature, the plesiosaur, about 50 feet long, certainly he would qualify as one of these tanin. Here's another one, Mosasaur, 50 feet long. I've got some mosasaur teeth back there you can look at. And then it says that God created every winged bird. Now, the word bird there is the word fowl. It's a little broader than the word bird. When you think of bird, you think of the bluebird or the blue jay or the robin. But it's much broader than that. It can refer to both feathered and unfeathered or non-feathered fowl, flying fowl. Here's one right here. This is Quetzalcoatlus, largest flying creature. We've discovered its fossil in, of all places, Texas. Everything's bigger in Texas, isn't it? Quetzalcoatlus, and that was named after the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, the serpent god. 40-foot wingspan. Notice his size compared to man. So that would definitely include him as well as other birds. Now in Genesis 1:24, day 6, it says, God made the cattle. What comes to your mind when you hear the word cattle? Cows, right? Yeah, cows. Well, that's what the scholars in the King James day thought they was, cattle. And that's the way they translated it. And every translation since then has followed that course. But it's not the word cow. As a matter of fact, there is a word, you can see it in Leviticus when they start talking about the sacrifices that do involve cattle. There, it's the word for livestock. So it's a totally different word. Here the word is behemoth. The Hebrew word behemoth means a large land creature distinct from the word beast and livestock. Does that ring a bell, behemoth? God revealed to Job when he said, look, behemoth I made as well as you. He's the chief of the beasts. Behemoth is just another variety of behemoth. It means a big land creature. Here's another behemoth, T-Rex and the long necks. Those would all be classed as behemoth. Now here's a surprising behemoth. This is the largest rhinoceros ever found. I had to hunt all over the place. I knew that this had been discovered in China back in the 1920s, and it was shipped to the United States. But it got buried in the museum someplace. I'm not sure why, but I would guess because they recognized it as having been discovered in dinosaur rock layers. Now what do? These big mammals weren't supposed to have existed alongside dinosaurs. So whoever said 65 million years back there needs to have some correction here. This is a big behemoth here, and it happens to be a large mammal. Now, to scale it, there's what it looked like compared to modern-day rhinoceroses, found in China. It was found by one of my boyhood heroes, and his name was Roy Chapman Andrews. He was the first to find dinosaur eggs in China. See the guy on the right there is Indiana Jones? Well, it was Roy Chapman Andrews who served as the model for Indiana Jones. Notice that Roy Chapman Andrews carries a pistol on his side and a campaign hat. And he was quite the explorer, too, in his day. He went all over the world and was a real Indiana Jones type character. He was the first to take these old Dodge touring cars into China, and he'd have camels bring the supplies behind him. They braved the bandits and the desert. There were no highways in China at that time. They went right into the heart of it in the Gobi Desert. And they brought back lots and lots of fossils, one of which was the big behemoth called the rhinoceros. Huge, and it just got buried in the museum. Now, he worked for the American Museum of Natural History. So it wasn't just some corner shop on the corner. This is a big museum. It continues to be one of the biggest museums today. But he worked for them, and that's where these bones reside, in the basement. Typically in museums, the big, real spectacular finds are never brought up to the public. They're all down below in the basement. And you get to study stuff like I've got back here, and the reproductions. They're not going to let you anywhere near these kinds of things. In Job chapter 40, we see behemoth, a particular kind of behemoth. And this behemoth is described exactly like this critter here called Brachiosaurus. He was 60 feet long. He was discovered in Colorado, again, by one of Marsh's teams in 1900. Job, it's actually God speaking to Job. Reminds him that his bones are as strong pieces of brass. And look at the leg bone. That's just one leg of one of these long necks. And you can see this dinosaur as it stands in comparison to another human. By the way, that skeleton there, that's the Brontosaurus, the dinosaur it never was. That skull, that is an old picture, and that's the original skull that Marsh had designed. Today, if you look at Brontosaurus, they've switched the heads out and called him Apatosaurus, and his name means deceptive lizard, and you can see why. In Job 41, there's another creature that's talked about, Leviathan. Now, a lot of people have speculated whether Leviathan was a megalodon or a mosasaur or something like this, but I don't think so, because the way they describe Leviathan, it's as if he has impenetrable plates on his back. And Mosasaur and Plesiosaur and Megalodon were all deep-sea creatures, whereas Leviathan seems to have been both a water and a land creature as you look at him in Job 41. So I've rethought this whole thing, and here's my idea of what Leviathan was. Purosaurus, 41 feet long. Look at him next to a little Volkswagen Bug. See how big he was? The average size crocodile today is what, 13 feet, 14 feet, something like that? This critter was 41 feet. And here's the skull in relation to a crocodile skull. Some artist wanted to portray him as very, very scary, so he shows him dueling T-Rex. In fact, if you go online, I can't remember the website, but there is a little video on the dueling T-Rex versus Sarcosuchus. Who's going to win? And you can see that acted out on the, you can see anything on the internet. That's how I know dinosaurs are still living today. Is going to they're all over the place, aren't they? But there's the skull. Now, that would have been, in my mind, much like Leviathan. Then in Genesis 1:31, he talks about creating the creeping things. And the Hebrew word means the things that crawl, hop, or jump. Here's a good one. Look at this one here. Now, you're all familiar with millipedes and centipedes, right? Do you have any of those out here? All the years I've lived here, I've never known to find them. Are there millipedes out here? Yeah, little ones like this. Well, you want to know how long the biggest millipede was in the fossil record? 7.5 feet long. How'd you like that thing crawling on you? Yeah, that's the other thing we find in the fossil record. There were a lot of huge creatures in the fossil record. And no one really seems to be able to answer that question, but I'm guessing it has to do with the amount of oxygen, probably, that was in the early Earth before the flood. Here's another big creature, the Meganeura, wingspan of 28 inches. There's a guy there who's going to hit him with his fly swatter. I don't think so. Have you ever seen a dragonfly that big? This would scare me. You could hear him coming a block away, couldn't you? Well, here's another big question people ask, and that is, listen, weren't dinosaurs too big to fit on the ark? I mean, these were huge creatures. This is one of the biggest stumbling blocks for parents. When I go to these homeschool conventions, the kids are enamored with this stuff. You can see they are. And the parents are looking like, I'm just real confused, How did Noah get those big dinosaurs on the ark? It's a real stumbling block for parents. And, you can see they were big. There's a Stegosaurus. Stegosaurus is another one of those interesting dinosaurs. You know what its name means? Roofed lizard. Well, what? Well, the first stegosaur that was found was a mess. When they found it, the plates were all over the place on the skeleton. And Marsh thought that the plates bent over the back of the dinosaur to protect its skin. And so he named it roofed lizard. It's maintained that name to this day. They've not corrected it. Stegosaurus. That's a big creature. That's the one they thought had 2 brains. You see how big his head was, not very big. And then there's the T-Rex down there. Pretty big creature. But here's how you answer that question. There's a hadrosaur egg. And by the way, I have a real hadrosaur egg back there. It's only about like this. And hadrosaurs grew to be about 35 feet long. So they must have had a fairly rapid growth spurt. Some estimate 10 feet in a year. How'd you like to supply the groceries for that kid? Growing 10 feet in the first year. My goodness. But the dinosaurs, in other words, weren't always big. A lot of them, they all had to grow up, and they all started out as younger critters. Here's a good example of that. There you see an adult T-Rex teeth. I have those back there in the case. You can see how big it was, over 12 inches long, complete with the root and the tooth. They found this little tooth here was 1.5 inches, and they concluded they had found a separate species. They named it Nanotyrannosaurus. Well, further research showed that what they were looking at was not a new species at all, but rather a juvenile Tyrannosaurus tooth. I have one back there. It's about 3 inches long. You can see it. This is a juvenile. So they grew like every other living thing grew. So a lot of our assumptions about dinosaurs in the last 20 to 30 years have totally changed, because this was a revolutionary concept to these guys. Yeah, dinosaurs grew. It's one of those, it's kind of an epiphany to many of them. But they grew. They had growth spurts. There's a very interesting fossil back there. It's a Triceratops frill bone. Now, the frill bone was that big sheet, or the shield that it had behind the horns. Those actually grew, and you can see, if you look closely, you can see the channels where veins and arteries were housed. They carried blood to the shield. As the Triceratops grew, so did the shield. And so this was really an enlightening thing to these paleontologists. These critters actually grew, and perhaps many of the fossils that we have labeled as species may not be species at all, but rather may be young and old dinosaurs. Yeah, kind of interesting thought, isn't it? Well, weren't there too many dinosaurs to fit on the ark? When you look at the typical evolutionary chart of dinosaurs, you'll see there are hundreds of them. And again, this is that confusion about species and how many species there are. When I was a kid, it was believed that there were 21 different species of Triceratops. Today, because of these enlightening views on growth, they think there are probably just 2. And I'm sure that further research is going to show that what they're actually looking at is just varieties within the same animal. But, who am I? So I think what we're really looking at is kind versus variety. And this is something just to ponder here. When God created living things, He created them after their kind. So the big question is, how many kinds of dinosaurs would have needed to be on the ark? Not how many varieties. Well, what's a kind? We don't know exactly what a kind is, except that we do know that there was reproduction within limits or barriers. So you had limits. You could have lots of variety within a certain animal, but and some animals just could not reproduce with others. It's like the dogs, the dog kind. How many varieties do you have? Well, there are lots of varieties of dogs, but dogs carry these genetic markers, and they all work together. So perhaps what we're looking at are just simply kinds of dinosaurs. Now, secular scientists estimate that there are between 15 and 20 different kinds of dinosaurs. If that's true, then what Noah would needed to have done was take on 30 young males and females, right? You got a mommy and a daddy. That's all you need to produce the variety in the dinosaurs that came off the ark after the flood. That seems just very, very simple. I don't know why we have so much trouble with that. But there it is. It's really quite simple. So if you take the ceratopsians, ceratopsian means horn-faced kind, and look at the variety there are. Some of these are just simply older dinosaurs and younger dinosaurs, and very old dinosaurs and retired dinosaurs. They're just different varieties. But one kind, a mommy and a daddy. How about the sauropods? His name means lizard foot, and it's another name that has not been corrected. These dinosaurs didn't have lizard feet at all. They had their own feet. They called them sauropods, or lizard feet. That just doesn't make sense. At any rate, we know them best as long-necked kinds. Well, how many mommies and daddies would you need to take on board to get the sauropod kind? How many? One of each. Yeah, mommy and a daddy, that's it. Not the varieties. In other words, Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, Brontosaurus, dinosaur never was, Apatosaurus, and so on and so forth. Those are all varieties. You just need a mommy and a daddy. That's all you'd need. How about the theropods? Now, this guy makes sense. His name means beast foot. And, of course, that's what his foot looks like, doesn't it? This three-toed critter with claws on his feet. Well, there's lots of variety within the theropod kind, but all you'd need would be a mommy and a daddy. How about the armored kind? Lots of variety, but just mommy and a daddy. The plated kind, Stegosaurus. And here's one of my favorites, the Pachycephalosaurs, the bone-headed kind. That's what the name means. Have you ever been called a bonehead, kids? Bonehead. I've been called a bonehead a lot. Pachycephalosaurs means bone-headed lizard. That's what it is. Notice the variety. These were the ones that the Vikings seem to have put on their ships as, the dragon heads. A lot of them are modeled exactly like these. The hadrosaur kind, or the duck-billed kind. The bones of this critter, for some reason, are spread out all over Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota. We find tons of them. In fact, all the bones back here that I've got on the table are hadrosaur kind, except for the Triceratops frill bones. The hadrosaurs, lots of variety. You just need a mommy and a daddy. So, really, Noah's job wasn't all that big. I mean, yeah, it was big. But you wouldn't need all of these varieties of dinosaurs to take on board. So, now here's a big question. What about the fossils? Doesn't it take millions of years for something to become a fossil? This is what I was taught when I was a kid. It takes millions of years for something to turn into a fossil. Dinosaur dies, lays there, and eventually it turns into a fossil. Were any of you taught that as little kids? Yeah, time was the hero when it came to paleontology. After all, that's what the word means, isn't it? The study of ancient things, or ancient living things, the study of ancient bones. Well, guess what? That's another one of these epiphanies that paleontologists had here in the last 40 to 50 years. Time is not the issue. And one of the reasons is they're finding all kinds of fossils that are obviously not that old. One of them is this hat. This is a miner's hat that's actually fossilized, and fossilized barbed wire. I have a couple of fossils in my collection. One is of a rose that was hung in a cave, and within a few weeks, it had enough aragonite or calcite crystal to completely encase it, and it looks like a fossilized rose, and it'll always stay that way. It won't rot. It's been encased. I've got a coin, an old coin that's embedded in limestone. Oh, what do you mean? Limestone's supposed to be one of these rocks that's millions of years old. How could that happen? Well, it doesn't take that long. When I was in Israel a few years ago, we were walking up and down the coast there near Tel Aviv, and I found a chain, a rusted chain, embedded in limestone. Isn't that interesting? And so it doesn't take a whole lot of time. You're probably familiar with this scene here. These are petrified logs from the so-called petrified forest in Arizona. It was really discovered that for something to be petrified or turned to stone, you had to have freedom from bacteria. Bacteria immediately go to work on something that has just died. It doesn't sit there for a while. I mean, it's immediately attacked by bacteria. And bacteria can clean a carcass in no time. It has to be free from oxygen. Oxygen is the great life giver. It's also the great killer. Kids, if you've ever put a banana out in a cabinet and let it sit there for a while and come back a few hours later and, oh, it's all what? Black. And that's from oxygen, oxidation. Apples do the same thing. So you've got to keep things free from oxygen, and you got to have the right chemical environment. You know, to this day, paleontologists are not sure how fossils are formed. They've tried all different kinds of natural duplication methods, like burying them in certain sand full of certain kinds of chemicals. They can't figure it out yet. No one's been able to form a fossil naturally. We've done a lot of stuff in the laboratory. We make diamonds now that are supposed to be the oldest minerals on Earth. We make them in the laboratory out of peanut butter. Guys, that should be your savior for this Christmas. Give your wife a jar of peanut butter. Yeah, diamonds made out of peanut butter because it's carbon. They realize that heat and pressure will change things rather quickly. We can produce coal in the laboratory in a short period of time. So it doesn't take time. It takes the right chemical environment. That's the key to petrification. Here is the process of deterioration. You got a little piggy that's died, and of course the pig begins to immediately fill up with gases from the decomposition and the bacteria, and you can see it begins to deteriorate. And then comes along the scavengers, and the wolves, the bears, and so on. Very interesting. If you go to Yellowstone Park and you go in June, that's the best time to see who survived and who didn't over the winter. Because you've got carcasses laying all over the place in Yellowstone. By the time July comes, there's not a carcass left. And it's not because the rangers go in there and pick them up. Animals take them away. They disappear in a hurry. You've got to have certain circumstances for petrification. Things do not naturally petrify. They must be buried under unusual circumstances. So fossils mostly show us rapid burial. And I have a lot of them up there. There's some graveyard fossils that are loaded. Hundreds, thousands of fossils in just one little plate like this. You can see it back there. They show disarticulation. That's what fossils show us. They are really evidence of a great catastrophe at one time in the past. Well, why aren't dinosaurs around today? Well, we know from the scripture that most dinosaurs probably died out. But if they were living at the time Noah was, they had to have been taken on the ark because they were land-dwelling, air-breathing creatures. And we know that they survived because Job, who came after the flood, wrote about them. So they had to be on the ark. But why didn't they survive? Well, there's a lot of speculation about it, but I think it had to do with a lot of environmental changes that took place after the flood. The fossil record shows this rich, warm climate with lots of living things, vegetation in the pre-flood world. The flood was the big game changer, and it brought about lots of changes and complete with the environmental changes. And I think, frankly, it just got too cold for dinosaurs. And I think it began to just die out. So the Genesis flood, I think, is really the answer to all of that. And it completely changed everything that we see. The key to understanding Earth history is the Genesis flood. So I'll open it up for some questions. If you've got some, speak real loudly. My wife tells me I'm hard of hearing, and that may be the case here. I just tell her, look, if you just look at me and let me see your lips, I no problem.
I have a microphone here, too. Any questions?
We got one over here.
Okay.
So do you have anything to say about some of the soft tissue they've been finding in fossils?
Yeah, actually, that's really a fantastic thing. I do have some dinosaur tendons back here that have been petrified. So soft tissue that's been petrified is all over the place. It's actually quite common. It's the stretchy stuff that shows no wear that's the really interesting stuff. And a lot of the things they're finding is, of all places in eastern Montana, this area out here is called the Hell Creek Formation. Paleontologists joke about it to describe it describes the condition of the bones out there. It's very desolate country. And the bones, a lot of the bones, you pick them up, they just crumble. They just fall away to nothing. But a lot of the soft tissue they're finding comes from this Hell Creek Formation. And that just is really an amazing thing. They'll slice open the bone that's obviously rock, and inside they find soft tissue. The big question is, how did it get that way? And the latest article I've read on it has to do with, well, they think polymers. Those of you who have some chemistry background, polymers are these long, complicated molecules. Plastics are an example of polymers. And I really had kind of an eye-opener the other day. I was out doing some cleaning. My wife insisted, okay, see, I had 75 plastic buckets of rocks out on the side of my house. And so when she disappeared for a few days, it was on some kind of a tour or something. And so I said, okay, I'm going to get rid of these things. So I spread them out in our back. So it's a nice rock garden back there. So now whenever I want to get a fossil or something, I go out there and dig fresh for it. But the buckets are gone. Anyway, one of the things I noticed, I picked up one bucket. And these are normally very hard plastic. You can't take a bucket you buy in Lowe's and break it. I mean, these things are very, very tough. Well, this bucket I picked up, and immediately the sides just cracked. It broke, just like that. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me that, okay, let's say they were polymers of some kind that protected these soft tissues for 65 million years. The problem is that polymers break down, and that's their best answer to the whole thing. Polymers will disintegrate. These buckets were out there for probably 2 years in the weather, and they were all in bad shape. I don't know if I'll be able to reuse any of them. So they do break down. But anyway, that's the real mystery today, is the soft tissue. And I think the mystery can be solved again by the Genesis flood. They were buried rapidly not too long ago, and some of the tissues were therefore preserved.
With dinosaurs and humans coexisting, are there many finds of human remains or tools with dinosaurs?
Not with dinosaurs that I know of, but one book that I read that was it was a real helpful book for me. It's called Bones of Contention. Have any of you read that book? That is a fantastic book. I've known about Martin Lubenow for many, many years. But this book it's a real eye-opener, because the amount of human skulls that have been found, that are fossil skulls, is pretty incredible. And so the big question is, do these come from before the flood and were buried in the flood, or do they come afterwards? A lot of our mental pictures of these fossil skulls have been colored by anthropology and paleoanthropology. There's really no need for it. I've got a big collection of reproductions of both ape skulls and human skulls, and you can sort them out, although they're given these fancy names, Homo erectus and Australopithecus and so on. You can sort them out. You can line up all of the ape-like skulls over here and all of the human-like skulls over here. So that's really what we've got in the way of the fossils. Homo erectus is just another version of modern man. Whether he was buried in the flood or after the flood is kind of the debate right now. Creationists aren't really sure. A lot of the fossils that we find, there are so many of them that are buried in what paleontologists have dated as the last 2 million years. But we don't really know where those fossils came from. And that's part of the big challenge right now, is trying to decide, were these buried in the flood and fossilized, or were they buried after the flood in post-localized flooding? And that's part of the difficulty. But there's a lot of evidence for man. It's just, I'm not sure that I can name something that, where the guy was eating a brontosaurus steak and was killed, and he was buried with that. That'd be a nice find, but I don't think we're going to find that.
Have scientists been able to extract DNA from any of the remains of these dinosaurs, say from the bone marrow or from the soft tissue?
Just parts. It's very degraded. DNA degrades very, very rapidly. We can't even put Tutankhamun's DNA together. It just degrades so rapidly. But they're finding little bits and pieces here and there. Jack Horner. Do you know that name, Jack Horner? Montana State University. He was the guy who advised Steven Spielberg on the Jurassic Park movies. He was the one that told him to name that dinosaur that chased the kids around in the kitchen. Remember that scene? That one scared me to death. When I saw that, I thought, there's no way I'm letting my kids see that. But he named that dinosaur Velociraptor. And that was a lie. You can see a replica of a Velociraptor skeleton back there. And Velociraptor was only 16 inches high. He was just an ankle biter. It was Deinonychus, that particular dinosaur that was featured in Jurassic Park. He was discovered not too far from where I grew up. And when I was a kid, it was quite an exciting find. But he was never called Velociraptor.
Well, one more question. Two more.
You mentioned the fossil record. What do you mean by that?
The fossil record is the sum total of all of the fossils that have been found to date. So they keep multiplying. Hundreds of thousands of fossils are in museums, and that doesn't include the fossils that private collectors like myself have. So it's the sum total. And when paleontologists look at these fossils, they spread them out. They know where they found them. And each one of those localities are given an age based upon their ideas of evolution. When for instance, that's why we know, or paleontologists believes that you have Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. Those are the three periods for dinosaurs. And certain dinosaurs lived in the Triassic, certain lived in the Jurassic, and certain dinosaurs lived in the Cretaceous.
You don't believe in the fossil record?
Excuse me?
So you don't believe in the fossil record?
I don't believe it as a time marker, no. The fossil record, if you look at it from a flood perspective, it has to do with flood order. This is the way the deposits were made during the flood. Some of them are pretty haphazard. I have a list, and I'm still compiling this list. It's over 100 fossils that have had to be moved in the ideas of evolution, because when they first find a fossil in a particular rock layer, it's given an age. Well, what happens if you find fossils of the same creature in layers above it or below it? Now what do? Well, there are over 100 of these things that have been found. And so, you've got this fossil found here. This is how we know the Cretaceous took place. Okay, but the same fossil shows up here. The coelacanth fish was a good example of that. It was thought to have died out 65 million years ago. It became an index fossil for the Cretaceous period. Well, in the 1930s, they began catching it alive. Now what do? And there are also fossils that are found below fossils that are used to index certain ages. Those are real problems. And so I don't believe we're looking at time markers. We are looking at flood order. And those rock layers could have easily been laid down very rapidly and consecutively, and with fossils in them that don't display age, but they displayed probably environment. So environments were buried and stacked. Anyway, no, I don't believe the fossil record is a record of time. It's a record of catastrophe.
How long did it take for Moses to build the ark?
For Noah to build the ark? Well, we don't know for sure, but there's indication that it took him about 100 years. Now, people back then, I think, were a lot different than people are today. Every time I pick up a hammer, I damage my fingers. I'm just not one of those guys that can do that. But those guys were very, very skilled. They could do things and plan things that we couldn't today. So they were very skilled at doing different things. I mean, look at the pyramids. We still don't know how they were constructed. And the ark is an amazing boat, wasn't it? 450 feet long. Can you imagine that? How long is it from here to the far wall? That'd be fine. Some of you kids, after this is over, get out there and pace it off, okay? So you can pace, this is equal to about 3 feet right there. And you can figure out how long is 450 feet. And this building could have fit inside the ark very easily.